Greetings, my dear ones. For this close reading segment, I want to read the famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, so-called abortion text in Exodus chapter 21. Why am I thinking about abortion in the Bible besides controversy mongering on YouTube? Because I had read this morning that a prominent evangelical biblical scholar had landed in hot water for remarks on abortion. I'll put a link to that down below, showing that this problem of how Christians are to think theologically and morally about abortion is an evergreen topic. I think it's one of the wildest topics in the world in a sense. Without even, don't worry, I'm not going to needle you about your particular view on abortion or mine in this video. But I find this topic so fascinating because when I was growing up in a very conservative Christian evangelical American white Western context as a child in the 1980s, this topic was what was in churches that I was in at the time, I sensed even as a child, like the center of the political and theological universe, and certainly was for many people I grew up around. And it kind of still was in the 90s, and it kind of still is for people today. And it's this topic that seemingly will not be resolved for people. So like Israelis and Palestinians, Americans and pro-life and pro-choice, it's like there are these mythic eternal conflicts in the hearts of people for all kinds of reasons, and this is one of them. So when I had read that this prominent biblical scholar had landed in this hot water over remarks on the abortion question, it kind of got my mind thinking, what does the Bible actually say about abortion? And doing some clicking around and some quick research, realizing, of course, that there's no great singular passage here, and that people have, and even faithful people, and certainly Christians have thought about abortion very differently throughout the years. I heard a very thoughtful presentation at a major scholarly conference a couple of years ago now, 2, 3, 4 years ago, in which someone very carefully laid out the evolution of Christian thought in America on this topic, in a way that suggested, as these presentations often go, that even people who could be considered conservative evangelical types had what today would be considered very moderate pro-choice type positions, or at least were a lot more open to that than they were after the 1970s and the 1980s, so that the current conservative American position, it is argued, is really a feature of the last couple of decades and divisive wedge politics, where you find an issue where people kind of disagree about 50-50 and in which is very emotional, and that makes a perfect wedge issue because you can come in and get people riled up against an opponent that seems fearsome enough, and you can just, if you put a lot of effort into it, you can just barely win, and civilization is at stake, and so on. And maybe those kinds of cynical takes on how this topic has come to prominence and stayed there are really true. I'm not really sure. But I remember in my very first class in my doctoral program, well, my first semester of classes, I had a seminar in the book of Exodus, and I remember paying very close attention to this passage, which I look at here in the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. I've got the physical version, I've got the screen version here in front of me. But this particular passage in Exodus 21, and we spent a considerable amount of time on it in that Exodus seminar with my doctoral advisor, Peter Machinist, wonderful world-class scholar of Hebrew language and Hebrew Bible. And we really just dwelt on this because of the multiple ambiguities in the passage. There is no single Bible passage on abortion, infanticide or penalties. These kinds of things exist, and the Bible just doesn't have very much to say about it. But this Exodus 21, particularly verses 22 through 24, is as close as you can get to something that gives you a direct window into how an ancient Israelite audience, in the Hebrew Bible at least, would have thought about the death of an unborn child. I'll put a translation to the text in English down below so you can look at it there. In fact, the translation you read makes quite a bit of a difference. I'll come back to that issue on the translation, particularly comparing just two. I know that there's a lot of research that could go on here, right? And I'll compare the NIV and the NRSV, if I remember to do that here in just a minute. But I want to read it in Hebrew really slowly here, or at least give my own sort of wooden translation of what's going on, pointing out just how difficult this passage is to use as an abortion text. Okay, and the context here is the law. Moses and the Israelites have gotten out of Egypt. They've come to Mount Sinai. God has thundered down the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And now in chapter 21, we see the series of case laws. If this happens, or when this happens, now this. Okay. Verse 22. When men fight or strive with each other, struggle with each other, I think often translated fight, viki. So when or if men fight and they strike, nagaf, if they end up striking, presumably on accident, if they strike an isha hara, a pregnant woman, isha hara, pregnant woman, if they strike her. Now, this phrase, this is one of the key phrases. Okay, so gotta slow down here. And her children, plural, come out. Way-yatse'u, yeladeyha. And her children come out. Yeled being the root there in yeladeyha, meaning child. What do you mean children come out? Like she has twins or like triplets or something? Or does it mean the things that are in her pregnant stomach? Maybe it's plural because the idea that yeled there could carry a little more weight than just a fetus, but presumably also could mean, the various kinds of things that come out of a woman at childbirth, water and blood and afterbirth and, the placenta and other kinds of things like that. So maybe that's why it's plural. There's a kind of anatomy being referred to there. If you look up that word, yeladeyha, elsewhere, just exactly that exact inflected form elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, you will find it used a few times, several times, very unproblematically, just to mean her children. But it always refers, I think, in these passages I'm looking at or comparing it to living children. Like, let me just do a quick search here. For example, if I search it up and I look, so like Genesis 30, verse 26, give me my wives and my children there. But same root, this idea. Or Genesis 33:6. Then the maids drew near, they and their children. Same term, yeladeyha, and they bowed down. Okay, so I don't think there are uses of this term. I'm just looking around. I have accordance on my computer here, but accordance uses the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia text. So it's just a way of seeing a translation and searching for stuff, which I cannot do on paper. I see, Job 39:3, when they crouch and give birth to their offspring, so the suffix there being the third feminine plural, their offspring, yeladeyhen, their offspring. So there you see it in the birth-giving context, okay? So you do have that there. But why am I focusing on this? I mean, this issue will be important for the text to come, that this thing that comes out, yatsa, come out, the children, probably refers to the fetus and the afterbirth and the things. Okay, so when men are fighting with each other and they strike a pregnant woman and her children or her birth, the produce of her womb comes out, but velo yihye ason, but there is no harm. This word ason is going to be our second important word for the passage. So what does it mean for the children to come out? Does it mean the children come out like the child comes out alive? Like it's just a premature live birth? Well, okay, this passage here said, but there is no harm. Ason. What does harm mean? Let's look at this word ason. This word ason is really interesting because it does not appear very often in the Bible at all. It seems like it only appears 5 times. Only in this Exodus passage, and then 3 other times clustered only in Genesis 42 and 44 in the Joseph story, like Genesis 42:4. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he feared that ason might come to him. Genesis 44:29. If you take this one also from me, Jacob says, and ason comes to him, you will bring down my gray hairs in sorrow to Sheol. So it seems to mean harm, but the kind of harm that is more than just, getting a bruise or breaking a bone or something like that. Maybe like the harm that is death, okay? Permanent harm. If 2 men are struggling with each other, fighting, and they strike a pregnant woman and her birth comes out, but there is no harm, he will surely be fined, anosh ye anesh, just as the Baal of the woman, the husband of the woman, this word Baal, kind of like the god Baal or Baal, but means master or lord. So this is a traditional phrase for a husband. He will surely, I guess the one who strikes the woman is the reference there, the subject or the object. He will surely be fined, okay, nifal, so it's passive. He will surely be fined just as, or according to what the Baal of the woman, the husband of the woman, will put upon him. And he will give according to the judges, or pay as much as the judges require. Okay, this all is if there is no harm. So the birth comes out. We're not told whether there's a live baby at this point, but if there's no other harm, I guess the fighting though caused the birth to come out. So the question hanging over us at this point is, did the fighting that caused the birth to come out cause a dead fetus to come out? And so that then the no further harm would mean no further ason to the woman, right? Otherwise, if you assume that the two men are fighting, they strike the woman, the birth comes out, let's say she's at 38 weeks pregnant or something, just about to give birth, and it comes out, and there's no harm to the woman and there's no harm to the baby. It just, this random fighting incident just caused the birth. Then I guess we're still paying a fine? Wait a minute, why would we be paying a fine? Just because the woman has been struck? No, I think this makes the more natural reading the idea that the no further ason that would occur would be to the woman, and that the birth coming out, the yeled, the children, is in fact a non-viable, non-live fetus, okay? So I think that's the most natural assumption. I'm not claiming it's the only assumption. But as you go through and read this, I think you have to ask, like, what is a natural basic reading here? And then do you try to read against the grain of that natural reading in order to get a result that you want? I think the natural reading here is that the ason would apply to the woman, because whatever has happened to the yeled, her births, that has already happened, right? And that's over with, and we're not dealing with a live baby in the passage at this point. Verse 23. But if there is ason, ve'imason yehyeh. But if there is ason, harm, if any harm follows, then it will be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Again, leaving so much ambiguous there, though. So all of that, so that second verse there, verse 23, doesn't really do, that second reference to ason doesn't really do anything for our ambiguity. It just clarifies now if there is that ason, you will now get what you get. So I think I think the most natural way to read this is that the ason, the harm that's being debated, would be, in other words, the children come out, you get a fine. So in other words, what's the penalty for causing what today we would call a miscarriage? Or it's not really an abortion, I guess. So we're making a kind of analogy. How are they thinking about the fetus? And the question, and I think the answer that this text is giving, and especially in context if we went deeper into this, is that they're thinking about it in terms of a fine. In other words, it's not an eye for an eye issue. It's not a life for life. It's not a burn for burn, hand for hand, foot for foot. It's a fine issue. It's a fine issue. Just like the issue is in the previous couple of verses, I should point out, Exodus 21:20, when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But how? But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. So in this context, it makes it sound as though, okay, there are certain lives that can be compensated with punishment, unspecified punishment. Some lives that would be compensated, or non-lives, with fines, and that's Exodus 21:22 very clearly stipulates a fine according to a judgment. And then there are some lives, like the life of the mother, if the mother is killed by the blow because of the birth, maybe even a complication from the premature birth, that then is a life for life scenario, okay? That is the life for life scenario. I think that's what this text is saying, making it not a suitable one for people who have a conservative pro-life view today to use it, right? I was thinking, and I'm going to wrap this up quickly. I know when I make super long videos, I don't know, people don't like to watch the whole video. But then when I make them too short, people are like, why didn't you mention this? Do you see how I'm caught in a total trap here as a YouTube Bible content creator? Okay. No one feels sorry for me in any way. Okay. I was also thinking, you know, it's weird, and I'll just trail off with this thought, and then return to the question of the translations where you see variability. Actually, let me do the translation issue first, then have the trailing off thought to end. If you read the NIV translation of Exodus 21, NIV Exodus 21, they skew the translation there in a way that I think wants to help the reader see this as a helpful text for coming up with a conservative pro-life reading. How so? Well, they just seize upon the ambiguity that we have here. Where is the NIV? It's not coming up very quickly on my computer. I'll paste the NIV down below, okay, for you to see. I should prepare these things better in advance. But basically what I'm suggesting is that the NIV makes it sound as though a little bit, as though the life for a life issue is really about the fetus, and that the scenario described as we were looking at the passage is one in which the child, oh, finally it just came up. It's like I'm on dial-up internet here. I gotta call my internet company. NIV, Exodus 21:22. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, so they translate and her children come out as gives birth prematurely, as though the baby comes out, but she has truly given birth. And the implication being, although they don't quite say, is that the child is alive, I think. But there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined. So you caused a premature birth, but the child is alive is the implication. Whereas the NRSV, which I think here just gives a better translation, says, when people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage. But actually the NRSV tries to put an interpretation in there by explicitly rendering the phrase a miscarriage. I happen to think, following the language based on the reading I gave in the first 15 minutes of the video here, that in fact that miscarriage reading seems like the most natural and correct one. It's not the only reading you could have. You can let me know down in the comments what you think about this. If you studied the text or if you're hearing about it for the first time, go back and read it, see what you think. But you see there the kind of the translation war there between the more conservative translation, the NIV, and the kind of favored Bible of scholars and more progressive people, the NRSV. How they'll skew the passage. Was it a premature birth, live birth, or was it a miscarriage, right? The other thing I wanted to mention here at the end is that other passages that could refer to a child in the womb that we don't often think about because maybe the theology of it just doesn't quite make sense would occur, like in Jeremiah chapter 1, when God speaks to the young prophet. What does he say to him about his life in the womb? Jeremiah 1:5. He says, before you were in the womb. I want to look up the text here so I could quote it correctly. Jeremiah 1:5. Oh yes. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. So on a very strict wooden literal reading, granted, I realize people would read this as a hyperbolic metaphor, but still, let's just read it woodenly and literally for a second. God is saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Suggesting, I guess, that there's a kind of pre-existence of the soul. So when does life begin, according to Jeremiah 1:5? It begins before you're even born. And in one of the most famous texts, really, that I think pro-life advocates, rightly, understandably, would want to bring up, Psalm 139. O Lord, you have searched and know me. Beautiful, beautiful psalm. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee? 139:13, for it was you who formed me in my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Gorgeous language. Certainly could suggest a kind of pro-life position because it suggests that the care that God has for the baby in the womb is intense. My frame was not hidden from you. Verse 16, your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In my book were written all the days that were formed for me when none of them as yet existed. Again, maybe a suggestion that life begins even before birth, even before the baby comes out, or maybe even, like in Jeremiah 1:5, maybe even before conception itself. This would not be an orthodox, lowercase o, standard Christian theological idea, the idea of preexistence of the souls, right? But it would suggest a further complication, not just that life begins at conception in this poetic imagery of Jeremiah and the Psalms, but that even before that, even in the very mind of God. Okay, at any rate, I'll conclude this close reading. Thanks for tuning in. Let me know what you think.